Welcome to the WaterTech of America Safety Training Series. This course will cover chemical release emergency response. The goal of this training is to provide safe, environmentally sound methods for cleanup and disposal of all types of chemical releases that may occur within a customer facility. First, we're going to go through a series of definitions that will be used in the presentation. The buddy system is a system where we work with a partner, so there's at least one person designated to observe the other and provide rapid assistance in the event of an emergency. A catastrophic release is defined as any release which impacts human health or the environment off WaterTech property. Decontamination is defined as the removal of hazardous substances from employees and their equipment to prevent the occurrence of adverse health effects. Emergency response, it is a response effort by employees from outside the immediate release area to an occurrence which results or is likely to result in an uncontrolled release of a hazardous substance. Emergency response releases are defined as all spills other than incidental chemical releases. Emergency response releases may be further divided into major releases and catastrophic releases. A hazardous substance is any substance which may cause adverse health or safety effects as a result of exposure, including any substance defined under Section 101.14 of CERCLA, any biological agent or other disease-causing agent, any substance listed by the U.S. Department of Transportation as hazardous materials under 49 CFR 172.101, any hazardous waste, meaning a waste or combination of waste as defined in 40 CFR 261.3 and 49 CFR Part 171.8, as well as any substance defined under SARA as extremely hazardous and 40 CFR Part 355 Appendix A and B. Immediate dangerous to life and health, IDLH, it's an atmospheric concentration of any toxic, corrosive or asphyxiate substance which poses an immediate threat to life or would interfere with an individual's ability to escape from a dangerous atmosphere. Incidental release is a response effort by employees in the immediate area to contain and clean up a released material with no potential safety or health hazard. Again, an incidental response is a response effort by employees in the immediate area to contain and clean up a released material with no potential safety or health hazard. An incidental chemical release is a release that is not part of a process and is confined within the plant operating area whose safety and health hazards are fully known by personnel in the area. Oxygen deficiency is defined as an atmosphere with less than 19.5% oxygen by volume. Permissible exposure limit, or PEL, is the maximum exposure an employee may receive of a regulated chemical during an 8-hour day, 40-hour work week witho/without experiencing ill effects. This is normally expressed in units of parts per million, ppm, for gases and vapors, or milligram per cubic meter of air, mg/m3, for solids and dusts. Promulgated and published by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, in 29 CFR 1910, subparts G and Z. Unless the PEL is published with a ceiling value, it is an 8-hour time-weighted average exposure measured in the worker's breathing zone. If the PEL is expressed as a ceiling value, then it is an absolute limit which must not be exceeded. The PEL may also have a skin indicator, which means that the material will penetrate unbroken skin. Regardless of the airborne concentration, skin contact is to be avoided. A spill or chemical release is defined as the spilling, leaking, pumping, pouring, emitting, emptying, or dumping of a hazardous substance. As a rule of thumb, if a substance has come out of the container in which it was stored and it is not part of the process, a spill has occurred. There are 3 zones. One is the cold zone, which is the area outside the warm zone where no exposure to hazardous materials would be expected to occur. PPE, beyond normal work uniform, is not necessary. Then we have the hot zone. The hot zone is the work area in which inhalation, oral, or dermal contact with hazardous materials can be expected. PPE shall be appropriate for the hazard involved in the area. The warm zone is the interface area between the hot zone and the cold zone, used principally for staging supplies and decontamination upon exiting the hot zone. There are forms available on our team site under Safety. If we have a chemical release, there is a chemical release worksheet that must be filled out, as well as a customer accident, injury, spill, and emergency contact call report. Again, if you have a spill that needs to be cleaned up, you will want to fill out a chemical release form and an emergency contact call report. There is a flow diagram that's included in our team site under Safety, within the Handouts folder. It pretty much outlines everything on the diagram that's shown on screen. We're going to go through this in detail on the next slides. So, the first thing we're going to do if there's a spill is to identify the spilled substance and evaluate the hazards. We approach the area cautiously and resist the urge to rush onto the scene. When attempting to identify a spilled substance, remember, do not walk into or touch any of the spilled material. Do not try to determine what the chemical is by tasting or sniffing, and do not breathe fumes, smoke, or vapors. To identify the spilled substance, we want to use all the information available to determine what it is, determine the health, physical, and environmental hazards presented by the spill. The objective of this step is to make an informed decision as to whether the spill should be classified as emergency response or incidental response. There's various methods to identify what the spilled material is. It's going to start with the label. The product labels will often include warnings, first aid info, phone numbers, and any safety information. We can also refer to the manifest for the proper shipping name, hazard class, and ID number, and then we can cross-reference those to the DOT Emergency Response Guidebook and the Wastemaster. Shipping papers will also contain the proper shipping name, hazard class, and ID number. HM will be checked if the material is a hazardous material. We want to look for placards. Hazard class and ID number can be cross-referenced to the Emergency Response Guidebook. Again, that's a DOT Emergency Response Guidebook. We can find knowledgeable people in the area. Somebody typically in the area may or may not be able to identify what the container is and what's inside of it. And we can also do tests. We can do field measurements like pH to begin to determine what it might be. Some of the reference materials for identifying the material properties are always your safety data sheet. That's going to include product information, hazardous ingredients, physical data, fire and explosion hazard data, health hazard data, reactivity data, what to do in an event of a spill or a leak, and any special protection information that might be needed. We can also look at the North American Emergency Response Guide, which provides information that can be used for initial response and selecting PPE and evacuation distances. Once we've identified the spill, we want to isolate the spill and assist any injured. This is a defensive step to protect nearby persons and property. We'll want to use barricade tape or station people at area entrances to alert people and personnel of the hazard. If anyone is injured, we want to assist them, contain the release, prevent it from spreading, prevent additional exposures, and shut down equipment only if it's possible to do so without entering the immediate hazard area. Incidental response spills must be reported to the customer, supervisor, or emergency coordinator. A customer accident injury spill emergency report must be completed by the employee to assure that proper follow-up action is taken. If the supervisor is not available at the time of the spill, cleanup may proceed as long as a minimum of 2 employees are present. The customer and supervisor must be contacted as soon as possible following the incident. If it's determined to be an emergency response spill, remember this is the last step of the response for any employee that is not a member of the emergency response team. Get out of the area until all response has been completed. If an evacuation is announced, leave the building through the nearest uninvolved exit and proceed to the assembly area as detailed in the contingency plan. If this spill is a WaterTech material, contact the office, who will contact Veolia's hazardous materials response team. If it's determined a partial evacuation is necessary, this would be an emergency response spill. The emergency coordinator will determine whether a partial evacuation is necessary. He or she will activate the alarm and evacuation of the affected area will immediately commence as outlined in their contingency plan. Affected personnel shall immediately proceed as directed and remain in that area until directed to go somewhere else or the area is cleared for a return to work. The emergency coordinator from the customer will determine whether any additional government agencies need to be contacted. If a full evacuation is necessary, we want to notify the authorities immediately. Again, this is determined by the emergency coordinator at the customer site, and he or she will activate the alarm and evacuation will commence as outlined in the customer's contingency plan. Once we've identified the spill, we need to look at putting on the proper PPE, shutting down any operating equipment, and trying to stop the source of the release. For personal protective equipment, refer to the PPE program, safety data sheet, or the North American Response Guide to determine the hazards presented by the release. We'll complete the customer accident injury call record in accordance with the contingency plan, and the PPE will depend on the severity of the release. We'll look at the recommendations in the safety data sheet based on a large spill. Less serious spills may not require the full PPE listed. Extreme cases may require additional equipment. The ultimate decision must be based on experience. Request assistance from the office if unsure of the necessary PPE to begin response activities. Once the proper PPE has been donned, if the spill involves a flammable substance, we want to immediately eliminate any sources of ignition from the area. We need to contain and control the release and clean it up. Appropriate action, or in some cases non-action, must be selected to assure everyone's safety. If action can be taken safely, one or a combination of the following may be used to correct the situation. Dike any free liquid to prevent the spill from covering a larger area. Transfer the contents to an intact compatible container. Place drum inside a second container, normally an 85-gallon salvage drum. Repair leak, or close the opening. Every effort should be made to prevent spilled material from entering any surface water or sewer drains. Absorbent pads and socks are available to block off manhole covers or direct flow away from soil. We want to approach the point of release to plug it, patch it, or otherwise stop the source of the release. Then we'll follow the general cleanup procedures for incidental spills using additional information found in the MSDS, product information sheets, and the DOT Emergency Response Guidebook. We're going to look to decontaminate any equipment. If any equipment has come in contact with the spilled chemical, it must be decontaminated. This will normally be accomplished with a water wash for corrosives. The equipment should be washed until there is no visible evidence of contamination. If the contamination is corrosive, the effluent from the wash should be tested with pH paper and the wash continued until it has a neutral pH. The effluent should be contained and tested to verify it is not a hazardous waste. This can be done by performing the decontamination within a confined area such as a tank, dike, or building with built-in containment. If the spilled material would result in waste which is corrosive but not toxic, it may be possible to pump it directly to the water treatment system for treatment, if the customer has one. If the equipment must be decontaminated with solvents, the solvents may not be sewered and must be disposed of properly. Personnel must also be decontaminated. If you've come in contact with the spilled chemical or you've entered the hot zone, you must be decontaminated. Do not attempt to neutralize a chemical contaminant to decontaminate personnel or PPE while the responder is still wearing it. Decontamination will normally be accomplished with a clear or a soapy water wash followed by a clear water rinse. Refer to the SDS or other literature for special methods or precautions for a specific contaminant. All responders' personal protective equipment should be washed until there is no visible evidence of contamination. Care must be exercised as the PPE is removed so that the responder is not contaminated by the rinse aid. The effluent from the decontamination should be contained and tested similar to the equipment. We want to verify it's not a hazardous waste. Try to perform the contamination in a contained area, and then if it's not deemed to be toxic, you can transfer it to a waste treatment facility. To manage the waste, all personnel in contact with the spilled chemical or the facility can now be returned to operating status. All emergency equipment shall be cleaned and fit for its intended use before operations are resumed. Emergency response spills which involve hazardous waste or affect hazardous waste operations, the customer will be in charge of returning the facility to normal operating status. For follow-up reporting and dissemination of information, we're going to refer to the Customer Accident Injury Spill Emergency Call Record. This must be filled out after end of every spill cleanup. Here are some general guidelines for non-hazardous dry and liquid chemicals, corrosive liquids, flammable liquids, and liquid and dry oxidizers. First, we'll deal with non-hazardous dry chemicals. We'll use the appropriate PPE for the material being handled. Use a wet-dry vac or broom and shovel to clean up the material. We'll clean up only one chemical type at a time. We won't mix the chemicals in a vacuum cleaner. We'll refer to the safety data sheet or product literature to determine if the chemical can be disposed of in the water treatment system. Check with the environmental coordinator at the customer. If the chemical cannot be disposed of, it must be stored in appropriate container and disposed of as special waste in approved landfill. When cleanup and disposal has been completed, wipe out the inside of the vacuum cleaner with paper towels and follow the manufacturer's instructions to clean up the wet-dry vac. For non-hazardous liquids, we will use the appropriate PPE for the material being handled. We'll recover free liquids using pumps or other means and place into an appropriate container. As part of the process identification, we will be sure to test the pH of the spilled material. If it's a pH of less than 4 or greater than 10, we'll have to neutralize the spill. We'll refer to the safety data sheet or product literature to determine the proper neutralizing agent and then add a sufficient amount to achieve neutrality between a pH of 6 and 8 and measure the pH again. If positively identified as a non-hazardous non-flammable liquid and neutralized to a pH of 6 to 8, use a wet-dry vacuum cleaner to clean up the residue. If unable to clean up the spill completely with the wet-dry vacuum, use a floor scrubber or mop. If the cleanup of a spill with a floor scrubber or mop is not functionally possible, use absorbent material. Use this procedure sparingly as it creates more waste for disposal. We want to refer to the safety data sheet or product literature before emptying liquid spills cleaned up in the wet-dry vac, and if it's not acceptable for sewer disposal, we'll use absorbent material and place in a drum for disposal off-site as special waste. All equipment used to clean up the spill should be rinsed with sufficient water to remove any residue of the spill material. The rinseate or cleanup solution from spill cleanup equipment should be disposed of in the same manner as the waste. Follow manufacturer's instructions to clean up the wet-dry vac. Be sure to wipe the inside of the vacuum dry and return it to its normal use area. Paper towels used for this purpose should be disposed of properly. Hazardous corrosive liquids. If an incidental corrosive liquid chemical or chemical mixture release occurs outside of the normal processing area, notify supervision immediately. If properly trained to handle corrosive liquid spills, confine and neutralize the spill using the proper PPE equipment. If you do not have training, protect the area until a trained emergency responder arrives. Refer to the safety data sheet or product literature to determine the neutralizing agent. Once the corrosive liquid chemical has been neutralized to a pH of 6 to 8, use the procedure described in the previous section for non-hazardous liquids for cleanup and spill. If an incidental release of hazardous flammable liquids occurs, notify a supervisor immediately. Block the area and eliminate all sources of ignition. If you're properly trained to handle flammable liquid spills, confine and absorb the spill with absorbent material using the proper PPE. Refer to the SDS for the proper absorbent materials and approved methods for cleanup. If you do not have training, protect the area until a trained emergency responder arrives. If you are trained, you can use the following procedures for cleanup and disposal of the contaminated absorbent. Any absorbent material used to clean up the flammable spill should be stored in an approved steel drum. Label and date the container used for storing the contaminated absorbent in accordance with local, state, and federal regulations. It can then be transported to the hazardous waste storage area or placed in a satellite accumulation drum of compatible waste, if available. For liquid oxidizers, if an incidental release of liquid oxidizer occur, we'll notify the supervisor, we'll block off the area. If we're trained to handle the oxidizer spill, we'll confine and absorb the spill with non-combustible absorbent material using the proper PPE. We can refer to the safety data sheet or product literature for the proper absorbent materials and approved methods for containment and cleanup. Do not allow the spilled material to come in contact with wood or other combustible materials. Do not use a combustible floor dry to absorb an oxidizer spill. Label and date pails or drums containing the cleanup material in accordance with the obsolete inventory and hazardous waste management SOP. Otherwise, protect the area until a trained emergency responder arrives. After the gross contamination has been removed, flush the area affected with large amounts of clear water and refer to the safety data sheet or product literature to determine the proper disposal. Do not allow dry oxidizers to contact water if at all possible. Determine the PPE to wear while cleaning up the dry material. We're going to pick up the spilled dry oxidizers with a non-sparking shovel and place in a non-combustible receptacle such as a metal drum. We'll refer to the product's safety data sheet to determine whether it is safe to sweep up the fine powder with the broom. We're going to label and date the pails or drum containing the cleanup material in accordance with obsolete inventory and hazardous waste management SOP. After the gross contamination has been removed, we'll flush the affected area with large amounts of clear water. It may be necessary to wear respiratory protection against the reaction products, especially if we're working with chlorine, and we'll refer to the safety data sheet and regulations to determine proper disposal. This concludes training for the guidelines for handling chemical response for incidental spills and what to do in the case of an emergency response spill. Please return to training today to complete the short quiz to complete this course.